I owned a small agricultural supply store, and my customers, who became, eternal friends, made me aware of the positions of Norm, and I looked forward every month to Randy Cook's articles. He had a column every month in the Echo Agriculture magazine, Acres USA, and the farmers that I knew, the people in agriculture, were extremely interested and concerned with the basic issues of why it was that despite how hard they worked, how high the quality was of their product, they still could not make a profit, and they were constantly being driven out of business. So it was looking for answers and finding answers to questions from organizations like Norm, and Randy Cook providing just seemingly very common sense illustration of what was going on in the economy, why was it not working as it should, etc. As I moved into academia, once my business failed, like all my farmer customers, I followed them into bankruptcy and ventured out here to Utah to try to start a new life in academia, which I'm very happy to do. But it's my pleasure to introduce the perspectives that are broadly accepted, followed, and championed by many of the people literally working with the earth to provide our raw materials for our economy. So I'm very, very happy to bring Randy out to explain that perspective that is so widely accepted and found with a great appeal to the people working with economics on a daily basis rather than thinking about it and talking about it. So if I may introduce Randy Cook, President of the National Organization for Raw Materials Economics. And thank you very much for coming out.
We're a 75-year-old organization. Our original research began in about 1936. I think I talk about that eventually in here, where it came from. It's been a curious piece of buried economic history, really. The function that raw materials economics, which is not ever what it called itself, it's been a name that's attached to it following its use or effectiveness in actual U.S. economic history, and it was popularized beginning in about 1970 as raw materials economics, or the National Organization for Raw Materials. At the time the organization began in 1936 through 38, it was called the Raw Materials National Council. It was organized in Iowa City, Sioux City, Iowa. The Sioux City Tribune editor, Owen L. Brownlee, Carl H. Wilkin, all kinds of names you've never heard of before and don't really need to know. These folks came together. Carl Wilkin was puzzled as the Depression, as I say, it was 1936, as the Depression set in 1933, from 1929, here comes 1933, Carl Wilkin, as a farmer in Walled Lake, Iowa, finds that a bushel of corn this week is selling for 88 cents a bushel. Next week, he finds out that it's selling for 16 cents a bushel. And he says, wait a minute. A bushel of corn is 56 pounds of yellow kernels, number 2 yellow corn. The amount of calories contained in this, if you were to burn it in your stove, or feed it to your hogs, or grind it in meal and eat it yourself, is the same last week as it is this week. How can it be worth 30 cents or 88 cents last week and 16 cents this week? And so that's what started his quest. He started to decide, what do I want to do here? What do I want to find out? I want to find out why this happened. What causes it? But my association with it started after I graduated from high school. I went to what they call a large Midwestern university. It was the largest teacher factory in the world at the time. I went there enrolling in the engineering school, expecting to become an electrical engineer. At that time, it worked on the term schedule. I don't know what you guys do here, but in the term arrangement, we had 3 terms in a year of school. So in 4 years, 12 terms of classes, you get your coursework done and you get your degree. And so at the end of my freshman term, I went into my academic advisor and I said, okay, I'll be enrolling for second term freshman. What kind of classes am I supposed to take? What do you suggest? So he says, there's your paper. Take this one. That's what you get. And I said, well, that was simple. How about third term freshman? What do you got? And he pulls another sheet off. Here you go. And I said, okay, that's real simple. You got this figured out. How about the rest of my 4 years worth of undergraduate education? And he says, yep, right here. And he whips them right off and flips them down there on the, that's what you take. I looked through them all, every last one of them, and I said, in 12 turns of classes, I get to choose one elective course. And I said, all the stuff I'm looking at on these sheets of paper, I already won honors for successfully completing in high school. And he says, well, of course. That means you got to go to grad school. Yeah, right. And I looked at him and I said, well, it looks like I'll be transferring out of engineering. And he says, you can't do that. I did. I did not get my degree. I got my BS, as they say. And it was a BS, not a BA. I got a BS in something other than electrical engineering. But I must say that in 1980, I did build a personal computer on my kitchen table. So I knew fairly well what was going on, and I could manipulate the stuff. I mean, I know that's not engineering, but nonetheless, my situation there with confronting my academic advisor was that the belief system operating was that the presumption in the class schedules and the grad school track and all that stuff simply threatened to withhold my credentials as a functioning, contributing, human, working person unless I accept the assumption that you do what you're told. You do what you're told and we'll give you a credential. We've got a prescription for you. And I didn't do it. I'd been working since I was 15 years old, running a paper route and doing all kinds of things, whatever I needed to do. I went through all that stuff. I didn't feel that prescription fit me, and so I said, bye, I'm going to go do something else. I transferred out of engineering. Now, engineering wasn't unique at that time. It was, there's been a similar prescription for economics education in schools since the time I went there. And it's delivered lots of trained economists into our society. Yet we find ourselves in an economy overburdened by debt, shedding much of our manufacturing and importing between 5 and 6 times the amount of stuff we need, incapable of balancing either our national balance sheet or our foreign trade accounts. Now, the prescription for training economists doesn't seem to have helped deliver a future with broader employment opportunities, more prosperity, less poverty, or policies that can enable those possibilities. But then my degree wasn't in economics either, so I didn't get a degree in electrical engineering or economics. So let's talk about economics. I came to the raw materials economics fairly late. I wasn't appraised of this until about 1996, 95, somewhere in there. I was trying to organize some political efforts for a farm organization that should probably remain nameless. I'll characterize it this way. It's an insurance company that owns a farm organization that organizes farmers, so farmers will never be organized. I was trying to organize some political meetings for that group. And In presenting, drawing some local farmers together and presenting some information to them, a friend of mine who I'd invited to attend too, finally sat there and asked me, I was laying all this stuff out, and he finally asked me, he says, he looked right in my ear and he says, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And it doesn't matter what it is. How are you going to pay for a national economy? How are you going to pay for lunch? How are you going to pay for your car? How are you going to pay your insurance bill? How are you going to pay your tuition? How are you going to pay for it? I don't care what it is. How are you going to pay your light bill? How are you going to pay for it? You have to have income enough to cover your bills. I don't care who you are or how you work, unless you are the federal government. With the federal government, you have the constitutional option of creating the money. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin and fix the standard of weights and measures. So the current operation of federal government assumes that that means, well, we can create whatever we need whenever we need it. And they've passed this mandate supposedly on to the Federal Reserve banks in their, they're, I don't know. They don't know what they're doing, is my concern. They don't care how to pay for it. In other words, the Federal Reserve Bank doesn't care how to pay for it. They figure that we can stick too big to fail, as Paul was saying. It's too big to fail. We just cover it by writing another check. We whip it off. We pay for it. But that's not really paying for it. That's not discharging your debt. The only way you can discharge your debt is by earning enough to cover it. You have to earn, somebody has to pay, somebody has to circulate money back to you for doing socially useful labor. But I want to start with lunch. And how many folks are intending to eat lunch? Do people eat lunch? You eat lunch? Some folks don't, I know. If you're going to eat lunch, did you grow what you're going to eat? Did you produce yourself the food that you're going to eat for lunch? And if you didn't, that means somebody else did. So you're dependent upon somebody else for anticipating your need. You need someone to know that you're going to get hungry today to feed you. We're all in that position. Somebody's going to anticipate your need, and hopefully they've done it sometime back about feeding you lunch, not only today, but tomorrow. Now we need to express our thankfulness to the people that do that. We need to say thank you, but we also need to pay them properly for what they do. That anticipation of need, that feeding people, is one of the things that much of politics never really seems to pay attention to. Whenever political change, perhaps a fundamental political change, a radical political change takes place, when it comes time to feed people, new government many times does not know how to do that. And the policies that are required to get the government to feed people are a whole lot different than they are when folks walk up and say, "You've screwed up, we're taking this government away from you." And the folks who walk in and take it away from you, perhaps in Libya, perhaps in Egypt, hopefully they know how to be able to feed people. It's important. Without it, folks die. But the policies that you can stand up and make a revolution on are sometimes, in fact most times, very different than the process of trying to get people fed. So getting your lunch is political. The people who are preparing your lunch have produced the food that you're going to eat, made those decisions a long time ago. Think about a hamburger patty. How many months ago would the producer have to have decided to produce beef which means breeding a bull and a cow, having a calf, raising that calf up to a slaughter weight, having the calf slaughtered, having the slaughter go through the grinder to make ground beef, having that frozen, having it stockpiled in an inventory, having it sent off to some fast food restaurant, if that's what you're eating. How many months ago did that decision have to be made so that you can choose your hamburger patty today? It's a long string of events. And at every step of the way, hopefully the folks who are engaged in that process are making a buck. If they don't make a buck, they don't do very long in the business. You know, as we've come to understand, the profit-making motive is what drives most of us or draws most of us into our activity. It's an important element of a private enterprise economy. Yeah, well, I want to openly express my gratitude to producers, you know, for producing what they do, for their skill, their labor, their forethought. I also give thanks that today I have the opportunity to earn tomorrow's lunch. Now, I'm going to present a prescription here in which each one of us, through our socially beneficial productive labor, can have enough income to pay those producers that proper price. And I'm not just talking about food, I'm talking about all raw materials. And we pay the rest of our bills, and we don't need debt. We don't need it. We can operate an economy. This is a policy that operated in this nation's history. It proved the proposition: if the price of raw materials at the first point of sale is in balance with the cost of labor and capital in the rest of the economy, you cannot have a depression. Now, if we're in a depression now, that means something with that statement hasn't been met yet. If the price of raw materials at the first point of sale is in balance with the cost of labor and capital in the rest of the economy, we cannot have a depression. Now, first, some definitions. All I can pass along here is information. I want you to know what I mean when I use these terms. You might not agree with what I define here, but this is what I mean when I say these words. The first one is wealth. I define wealth as anything that is a boon to human life, either by energizing us, supporting us, or extending our abilities. It's created by the application of human intelligence and energy to raw materials. Now, there's a guy named Frederick Soddy. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him. He was a Nobel laureate chemist, 1921. He quit chemistry and went into studying economics. He wrote a book called Wealth, Virtual Wealth, and Debt. I would recommend it to anybody. He also wrote a book called National Income, which I would also recommend. But anyway, I identified two different kinds of wealth. Wealth one, wealth two, he said. One of them is valuable to us like food because it disappears into us. You know, the value of food is because it energizes us. It gives up its energy, we get it, and we are energized. The second kind of wealth is the kind of wealth that is, well, a lot of folks call it permanent wealth. Well, it's wealth that when its energy comes out of it, it's like our house, the house that we live in. It's like this building right here. If the energy comes out of this building, what happens to it? It collapses. So the giving up of its energy is a bad thing. We like it to maintain its energetic arrangement. We like it to be just the way it is. And so there are two different kinds of wealth. It is not a big deal. Let's move on here. Value. The one thing about wealth, I will say, wealth is not money. We can move on to value. Value as a concept can mean most anything to anybody else, but the ultimate measure of value is human labor or human energy, human work. We got to work to eat. We got to eat to work. That's the cycle we're in. The hierarchy of human necessities: air, water, food, shelter. Only air is provided, at least at sea level above ground, freely. You get air. We got air here. Water, maybe you got water, maybe you don't. Food, you have to work to get, for sure. Shelter, you have to work even harder to get. So, wild berries feed no one until somebody picks them. Are wild berries wealth? No. They're just wild berries. Until somebody picks them, until you can get them in your mouth, they're not wealth. They're not helping to sustain you. They're not helping to sustain humanity on the planet. That's the essence of wealth. Money, here's an item to define. Money is nothing other than a claim on wealth. That's all it is. Money claims wealth. You either have the money or you have the wealth, unless you're a thief. This might be a good definition of thievery. If you go to some place and have money and you expect to get wealth, and you wind up coming away with both the wealth and the money, that's a thief. It's like going to the store. You walk into the store, you want a gallon of milk. You grab a gallon of milk out of the cooler and you walk up to the checkout and you plop it on the checkout. And you in order to get out of the store without setting off the alarms, you have to change money for the milk. Well, so you put the money in the machine and it sucks it up and says, okay, you're good to go. Well, the money bought the milk. The other side is also actually true. The milk bought the money. That's an exchange. It goes around. It's a small point, but it's important because the wealth is the function that we're concentrating on. Money is not what we came to this country to make. We came to make wealth and make people wealthy. We want a wealthy nation. Nowadays, what we have is lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money, but I'm not sure we have a whole lot of wealth here. We contract for its creation in other places, and we exchange money, but part of our problem is that the money that we're making is created out of thin air with the push of a computer key, and we wind up using the wealth of other people, or using the labor or the energy of other people to create wealth instead of us doing it ourselves. It's an untenable situation. Credit is simply the ability to go into debt. The only way to pay a debt is to earn enough income to settle it before it's overdue. Capital, any means of production when it is used in production. Capital is created by labor and not the other way around. And I want to read you an observation from 150 years ago. 150 years ago. There is one point with its connections, not so hackneyed as most others, to which I ask a brief attention. It is the effort to place capital on an equal footing with, if not above, labor in the structure of government. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. Capital has its rights, which are as worthy of protection as any other rights, nor is it denied that there is, and probably always will be, a relation between labor and capital producing mutual benefits. The error is in assuming that the whole labor of community exists within that relation. A few men own capital, and that few avoid labor themselves, and with their capital hire or buy another few to labor for them. Many independent men everywhere in these states a few years back in their lives were hired laborers. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages for a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land himself, then labors on his own account another while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. This is the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way to all, gives hope to all, and improvement of condition to all, energy and progress. No men living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty, none less inclined to take or touch aught which they have not honestly earned. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely be used to close the door of advancement against such as they, and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them, till all of liberty shall be lost. Anybody heard that before? Anybody know who said that 150 years ago? Annual Message to Congress, December 3rd, 1861, Abraham Lincoln. Now we got an equation. Let me try getting this up here. Income equals production times price. That's all I'm saying here. If you've got income, you made some production and you charged a price for it. Now, whether that's you're a day laborer and you're working for a wage rate, or whether you've a raw material producer, it doesn't matter. It all comes out the same. A nation is considered in the same fashion. The income of a nation is its production times the price that it pays for that production. That's all it is. At Norm, we use national income. Our analysis is based on Simon Kuznets's method of separating out national income, or using national income as a measurement for economic activity. I had a nice image here. We got this is part of our technological problem. What I hope to do is to be able to send along my images. We can edit this into our my talk and get it on the record as when you access it through the internet. I can put my pictures and things in here. National income, as I say, is composed of 6 categories. This is the way Simon Kuznets, this is not Norm, we didn't invent this. Simon Kuznets won a Nobel Prize for this sort of work. 6 categories in the national income. 4 of them we identify as the revenue segment. 2 of them we identify as the expenditure segment. The expenditure categories are wages, salaries, and supplements, and net interest. The 4 revenue segments are known as corporate profits before taxes, unincorporated business income, rental income to persons, and farm income. What Norm does is analyzes the national income and looks at the relationships between the segments in the numbers, in the statistical analysis. And we can identify the characteristics of prosperity, which is the next item I want to define. Prosperity is available employment, steady or increasing savings, decreasing debts, stable monetary purchasing power, which seems to be something nobody wants to pay attention to anymore. Solvency, an excess of income over expenditure. In other words, savings. Out of savings, you can take some investments, money, some capital for investment. Borrowing above and beyond savings, excessive borrowing eventually destroys the income-generating mechanism, which is the physical economy upon which the financial system sits and from which it draws its existence. And finally, the last item I've got here for a definition is parity. Parity is equal exchange value. Maybe I should write that on there. That's one of the things that Norm is associated with, probably more than anything else. Parity. Equal exchange value comes from the Latin paritas. Equal exchange. It's most equal exchange value, barter value. If I make a deal with you that I'm going to trade my tie for somebody's sock, and you feel happy about it, and I feel happy about it, then we have exchanged equal value. That's a par exchange, a parity exchange. Most of the time you hear the word parity used in relationship to sports teams and sports leagues. Why, there's parity in the National Hockey League. Anybody can beat anybody else today. Which means everybody's about on the same basis. Everybody has approximately the same winning potential. Any team does. And so everybody has essentially an even shot at the title. That's what parity is used when it's talked about in terms of sports teams. When it's talked about in terms of economics, it means that everybody has the same dollar. The purchasing power of the dollar for the farmer is the same as the purchasing power of the dollar for a banker. Or my favorite term, bankster. I like gangster only with a B. But anyway, that's parity. That's yeah, our study was initiated in 1936 by Carl Wilkin. Every economy begins with raw material production. This stuff, the lights, the carpeting, the seats, your clothes, it all came from stuff. Cotton, oil, ag production, livestock, crops, minerals, fuels, metals. All the stuff we've got here that we call our standard of living all started with somebody producing some raw materials. Human labor mixed with raw materials being provided in sufficient quantity to do something else with it, more than somebody needs to live with it on their own. Some excess production. Our analysis has been essentially called a helicopter audit of the physical economy. The physical economy, the production of the raw materials, the satisfaction of the needs of hunger, of air, water, food, shelter. The physical economy upon which the financial section of the economy sits and depends for its life. I'll get to a little bit later with the AAA Act of 1933 when we had the Depression, the change of political power. But our physical economy, no economy has ever been started by a primordial loan. An initial debt from which all subsequent growth or development proceeded. You know, where did civilization come from? Did God lean down and say, hey, I'll make you a loan if you'll do this? Only 6% interest, you know, I'll collect it in 30 years. No. Human beings started digging up dirt and planting seeds or shooting deer and you know, creating meat and vegetables and all this stuff. I mean, it happens with raw materials being acted upon by labor, and it's from those beginnings that what we have got here started. There wasn't a primordial loan that made civilization suddenly happen. It was human beings expending their energy upon raw materials to make all this stuff start. Now, the IMF and World Bank appear to have been trying that method for the last 40 years. The result of that approach in the world around us cannot be characterized as prosperity, in my assessment. That's a personal opinion. How then can a nation become wealthy given our definitions and the constraints of reality? In 1769, more than 7 years before our Declaration of Independence, when Benjamin Franklin was 63 years old, he published an observation entitled Positions to be Examined Concerning National Wealth. This was before The Wealth of Nations, published by Adam Smith, which came out in 1776, same year as the Declaration of Independence. This was in 1769. Positions to be examined concerning national wealth. Ben Franklin writes, he says, there seem to be but 3 ways for a nation to acquire wealth. The first is by war, as the Romans did, plundering their conquered neighbors. Oh boy, that's awful. My handwriting is terrible here. I don't have anything to brace myself with. War, as the Romans did in plundering their conquered neighbors. This is robbery. Commerce is the second way a nation can become wealthy. Which is generally cheating. And we'll get into that later, but I wanted to, this is the whole thing that Franklin wrote. He says, the third is by agriculture, the only honest way, wherein man receives a real increase of the seed thrown into the ground in a kind of continual miracle wrought by the hand of God in his favor as a reward for his innocent life and his virtuous industry. At the beginning of our nation, 9 out of every 10 people were engaged in raw material production, most of those in agriculture. By 1850, that ratio was 1 out of 2. From 1850 through 1920, the ratio moved to 1 out of 3. As new land was brought into agricultural production, new mines were opened, new industries established. From 1920 through 1950, the ratio moved to 1 out of 5 people engaged in raw material production. What that tells us is that as we continually develop through the application of our human intelligence and our energy on the production of the raw materials, on the reinvestment of our capital, what we extract or develop during those episodes where we create that wealth, we can reinvest it in what we do. It's like kind of like the personal computer revolution. When the first 8-bit processors were used, they were programmed to design 16-bit processors. The 16-bit processors were used to define the 32s. The 32s were used to define the 64s. And the process, the progress, the rate of progress of the development of the personal computer has gone exponential because of the power of the reinvestment of the technology that was already developed. So that's what we've got going on here. Now, what that does is it releases labor for other uses. The less people we need to produce the raw materials because of their productive efficiency, the more those folks can go do something else. And that's good. That's wonderful. We got a division of labor. We can spread things out. We can create new things, add them to our standard of living. We don't all have to be out here making our own lunch. For the record, we can observe 3 periods during the 20th century that can be classified as prosperity periods: 1910 to 14, 1925 to 29, 1942 to 52. To avoid the association with a wartime economy, we use the 3 years 1947 to 49 as the prosperous base period for the third interval, 1947 to 49. During each of these 3 periods, all segments of the national income were able to exchange their production with the other segments, while savings were increasing, debts were decreasing, domestic purchasing power remained quite uniform on average during the period of each of the 6 segments. We had parity, we had balance. The purchasing power of our currency from each of those 3 periods was vastly different. The technological development of our economy was different. I mean, in 1947 to 49, we had cars as a standard element of our standard of living. In 1910 to 14, we didn't have that. We didn't have radio. We didn't really have air travel. You know, the Wright brothers had just been able to fly in 1903. They didn't even sell their plane to the French until, what, 1917, 1916. The ratios between the relationships between the various segments of the national income were always exhibited the same relationship. In other words, these three periods, the 1925 to 29, uh, 1910, whoops, oh, well, let's do this. That'll help. And 1947 to 1949. The same ratios happened. The ratio of revenue to expenditure. You'll have to pardon my terrible penmanship here. I had this all nicely worked out and can't show it to you. Well, they worked out like this. Revenues were essentially 33% and 67% was expenditures in all three of these periods. Now, like I said before, the revenue section here, this is unincorporated business income, rental income to persons, corporate profits before taxes, and farm income was 33% of the national income. The expenditures, wages, salaries, and supplements, and net interest was 2/3. That's what balance looked like for the United States economy from 1910 to 14, from 1925 to 29, from 1947 to 49. The curiosity about the 47 to 49 period compared to the other three, or the other two, the first two, 1910 to 14, 1925 to 29, happened by historical happenstance. I mean, we could talk about that if you want to, but the 47 to 49 period was produced by policy, actually adopted by government. We learned how to do it. One of the other, now this is just the relationship between the revenue and the expenditure portions of national income. One of the other ratios that we look at, which is different, slightly different, it's called the income of private enterprise. We look at private enterprise is corporate profits after taxes, unincorporated business income, and farm income. We leave out the rental, but we add those three components together and compare it to national income. And what we find out is that one, every time we've had a depression in our history, that ratio has dropped below 26%. Currently, that ratio is 20.5%. Duh. That's kind of what we get. We can figure this stuff out. As far as 2010 goes, here are the current figures for the revenue and expenditure portions of the national income. For 2010, expenditures, instead of being 67%, this is now 73%. And so this is 27. In other words, we are not close to the balance of our prosperous periods. We are not enjoying prosperity. Well, part of what's happening is that this is an indicator, it's not a cause. The national income is just a statistic. We just look at it as it's reported, and we can analyze where the problem lays. we're not generating sufficient national income to pay the expenditures necessary to operate our physical economy. Now, I had a piece laid out here as far as well, let's talk about it here. The most significant relationship uncovered in our analysis is that the relationship between gross raw material income and national income. Now, gross raw material income is the gross income generated by the sale or the sale into commercial channels of all the raw materials produced in our nation in 1 year. Now, of that total, 70% of all those raw materials come right off our farms. And we can look at that number. It changes from year to year, time to time, depending on the price of oil, the price of wheat, and all kinds of things. But historically, the 80-year average for the ratio of farm raw materials to total raw material production as far as gross income goes is 78%. Historically, over 80 years, 78% of our raw materials produced every year are 78% farm related. So 78% of our raw materials come right off the farms. That puts agriculture in the driving position for our physical economy. So the health of our farms, the prosperity of our farms, the economic health of our farms determines the health of our physical economic sector. The turnover of the gross farm dollar in 1947 to 49 showed that for every dollar of gross farm income, we would generate $7 of national income. There was what was then identified as a 1 to 1 to 7 ratio. $1 of gross farm income. The problem with national income is it tries to measure everything in nets, try to avoid duplication. So the gross farm income is not a number that's usually included in national income calculation. That's why everybody misses the relationship. But in 47 to 49, the 1 to 1 to 7, in fact, it happened in the second period too. There's a 1 to 1 to 7. $1 of gross farm income, $1 of industrial wages paid, and $7 of national income created. 117. The income of our farm production creates the employment in our factories, creates our national income that we need to pay to exchange the wealth, process, distribute, exchange the wealth that we produce as our standard of living every year without the need for debt. It's been 6 decades, 47 to 49, 60 years on that is 2009. So it's been 6 decades since we had a balanced economic period. This 1 to 1 to 7 ratio, I've tried to recalculate it several times. The last time I did an estimate of it, it now comes out to about 1 to, I don't know what the industrial rate is, it's less than 1 now, and the national income turnover is about 8, slightly over 8. So we're generating $8. What that says is we're even in more precarious position. As you multiply a lever, if you're generating 8 times the movement out here with 1 movement in here, when you lose 1 in here, you're going to lose 8 out there. So we get more and more precarious in the potential for our solvency as a nation. We lose $8 of national income for every $1 of lost farm income. Now, you remember our equation, the income equals production times price? If our nation is not generating sufficient income, and yet we are making the production, there's one term we haven't dealt with, which is price. The price at the first point of sale on our raw material production determines our national income and limits the return on investment of our nation, what we call the profit in the system. This is not the same thing as an individual business's profit. One of the major confusions today is the difference between business profit and systemic profit. Our failure to maintain a systemic profit since 1952 is the root cause of our mounting public and private debt. The recent credit crunch thievery by brokers and banksters, besides being massive fraud, is evidence that operating without a systemic profit for 6 decades has brought our economy to a crisis. If we don't return to economic policies similar to those that worked during the 47 to 49 period, we may lose our original and unique political system. Buckminster Fuller, anybody know who he was? R. Buckminster Fuller, he invented geodesic domes and stuff. In the 1930s, he invented not only the house itself, but the manufacturing method so that he could deliver by helicopter temporary shelter to people of natural disaster problems. You could fly it out, you could drop this thing on the ground, you could take a winch and crank it up, and here's a shelter. Boom. It was not a tent, it was an actual solid house. Had a built-in toilet, kitchen, the whole thing. He was doing that in 1936. Anyway, he suggested that this planet be named for the most common thought emanating from it. Let me see if I can spell this one. Chisel. Chisel. Bucky Fuller said this planet should be named for the common thought that emanates from it. He says Earth should be called Chisel. I'm a chiseler, are you? Chisel, 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 chisel. I need to get rich because you don't need to be rich. You don't need to be near as rich as me. I need your money, and I need it without me having to pay for it. I am going to cook up some scheme, just like Bernie Madoff, to try and make sure that you don't get your money back. I'm going to take your money. I'm going to chisel it out of you. Chisel, 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 chisel. That was Buckminster Fuller's experience with this world. These houses that he invented, he couldn't get anybody to fund it. They all wanted to buy it. As soon as they bought it, they mothballed it. They said, no, we make money off of that. You know, it's the Paul Simon tune, you know, sorrows everywhere you turn. And that's worth something when you think about it. That is worth some money. So, anyway, much has been written and misunderstood about our 1930s depression. The popular lore is that overproduction caused low farm prices. Now, I had some numbers up here that I don't even have in here, but essentially what I got, the slide that I had right in here was comparing 1928 and 1932. 1928 was a year of prosperity. 1932 was a year of depression. The actual production of wheat, corn, rye, barley, flax, rice, oats, I think those are it. 7 major crops. In 1928 was slightly above what we produced of those crops in 1932. In other words, we produced more in 1928 than we did in 1932 of 7 major crops. Now, as far as meat goes, livestock that we produced slightly more meat in 1928 than we did in 1932. Yet 1 year was a year of prosperity and 1 year was a year of depression. What was the difference between those 2 years? In 1 year, in 1932, we said, we got this stuff, it's piled up everywhere. Well, we can't get it. Why, you're producing too much, farmers. Well, no, technically, we produced less in 1932 than we did in 1928. The difference was the price for which it sold. The price for which it sold in 1928 was at parity. The price that it sold for in 1932 was about 54% of parity. And because it was only about half, it only generated half the national income, and we only had half enough income to buy up what was produced. And so the unconsumed farm production out here was sitting around because we couldn't afford to buy it. We couldn't afford to buy it because we didn't create the income. Production equals income, or income equals production times price. We made the production, we didn't get the price, we lost the income, we couldn't buy the production. We didn't have the income. You know, even there was a rise in prices in 1937. Even after that, we tried to come out of the Depression in by 37 we had a rise in farm prices a little bit. They fell back again. They didn't recover until about 1941, due mainly to the war in Europe, the disruption of shipping in the Atlantic Ocean by German submarines. In 1933, the year Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, they declared a national emergency. Just so you'll know, Congress stated, and they were quite correct in this, low farm prices imperil the agricultural assets underpinning the national credit structure. Well, they weren't quite so dumb then. Low farm prices imperil the agricultural assets underpinning the national credit structure. And they declared an emergency. And they said, we're going to take the marketing rights of every farmer in the nation in the national public interest. And they did. A national emergency was declared, and the marketing rights of every farmer in the nation were taken in the national public interest. That is a Fifth Amendment taking, and it needs to be provided with just compensation. That's what the Constitution says. If you take private property in the national public interest, you have to provide just compensation. So they provided just compensation by saying it's a policy of Congress that we will mandate that parity pricing be paid for all of the stuff that gets marketed off the farms and yada, yada, yada. Well, the problem was they didn't know how to do that. This is 1933. Carl Wilkin didn't start his research until 1936. They tried first at the Agricultural Adjustment Act. They tried what was called a processor tax. They said we're going to tax if you grow wheat and you sell your wheat to a miller, then the miller is going to be charged a tax on the wheat he buys, and he's going to send that tax money to the federal treasury, and then the federal treasury will take that tax money and write a check back to the farmer for what he missed between what should have been a parity price and what he actually sold the wheat to the miller for, and so he didn't get his parity price. And and the Supreme Court came out in 1936 in the Butler decision, U.S. v. Butler, also called the Hoosac-Mills decision, and it said you can't do that. You can't tax this group of people right here, pay up, and we're going to give it to these folks over here. Now, I think they were right in that. You know, you can't tax one group of people to the benefit of another. So the Congress in their AAA Act were trying to tax the processors of raw farm products and send the money back to the farmers. So Congress, although they thought parity was a good idea, they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to implement a policy of parity pricing. The curiosity about the AAA Act is that it got thrown out by the Supreme Court in 1936. In 1937, 38, Congress came right back and passed the same thing again. They called it something different. They called it first the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act, and then there was the Agricultural Soil Conservation Act, and they re-implemented all of the same provisions, the declaration of emergency and the declaration of policy for parity pricing. And if you look in the U.S. Code today, it's Title VII, Section 601 and 602, you can find out that the provisions for both the declaration of emergency and the parity pricing are still current law. Very strange. Which means that the national emergency goes on and on today. We've been under a national emergency since 1933. Never been ended. We're still there. Yeah, doesn't make much sense to me, but that's we may need it more today than ever before. So they didn't know how to make parity pricing work. With the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Congress got scared witless, shall we say, for lack of a better term. And we're looking around. By this time, Carl Wilkin had done his research. It took him about 3 years, 36 to 39, 40. In 1941, he started presenting it to Congress with the help of the NASDA, National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Anyway, it was taught to Congress. And with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Congress got scared, said, oh my Lord, here we are. We got 12, 13 years worth of depression we've been dealing with. Now we just got militarily blown up in the Pacific Ocean. Our fleet is on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. What are we going to do? We need to do it now. And Carl Wilkins said, if the price of raw materials at the first point of sale is in balance with the costs of labor and capital and the rest of the economy, you cannot have a depression. If the price of raw materials at the first point of sale is in balance with the costs of labor and capital, which is net interest, in the rest of the economy, you cannot have a depression. I don't care who you are as a nation. That is a national prescription. If the cost or if the price of raw materials at the first point of sale, if they come into our economy in balance with the costs of labor and capital, you cannot have a depression. Because by definition, we are paying the proper price for the raw material production that creates the basis of our standard of living. Parity pricing is nothing more than that. It is the price, the proper price that is in balance enough to generate sufficient national income to process, distribute, and consume our standard of living on an annual basis without any need for debt. That's all it is. Now, in 1942, Congress passed what was called the Stegall Amendment, which mandated that this parity pricing policy shall work for 2 years following the end of the war. And one of the curious byproducts of the parity pricing policy adopted in 1942 by the Congress was that the futures markets, the commodity futures markets, shut down. During World War II, this country didn't have any commodity futures trading. There was nothing for them to do. The prices of the commodities were calculated by mathematics every 30 days. This is what you've got to have for a price. This is what the price is going to be. We don't need pit traders to discover the price of wheat by trial and error, which is a euphemism for stealing, because we can calculate it from mathematics. We know what the price needs to be. We know how much production we need for our economy, or approximately so. I mean, this isn't rocket science, and we don't have to know to the nearest penny how much national income we have to do. But we have to get close enough so that the farmers, the miners, the oil men, the livestock processors, or the producers, all of these folks can have their pay so that the national income gets created to process and distribute and consume the stuff that we expect to have. That's where our national income comes from. Curiously, in 1942, Congress appropriated enough money. Congress appropriated enough money in 1942 to hire every man, woman, and child in the United States at prevailing labor rates. Yeah. They couldn't spend the money. Do you know why they couldn't spend the money? There wasn't enough stuff to buy to spend the money on it. We weren't making the production. I mean, that was the whole point, was that the 12 years of depression had left us not producing. We couldn't afford to produce. We couldn't afford to consume. We couldn't afford. So anyway, Wilkin told them, and he said, if you implement parity pricing, you can have this economy back on its feet in 6 months. Ah, well, I better hurry. We've heard that World War II fixed our economy. On its face, it appears truthful. But what was it about World War II that did the fixing? You know, if the statement is true, why have wars in Korea, Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, you know? Haven't fixed our economy. What was it about World War II that fixed our economy? Well, the point was that it was this parity agriculture policy. And it kept us out of depression following the war. Following World War I, our experience had been 1920-21 was a depression. We had a war, inflation, and then after the war, World War I, we had a depression. And because the Stegall Amendment said this parity pricing policy will carry over for 2 years following the war, we had what in the United States has been referred to as the post-war boom. One of the things that happened in the post-war boom was that General Woods at Sears and Roebuck took Sears and Roebuck from 1946 to 1952 in 6 short years, made Sears and Roebuck the largest retail establishment in the world. He was the man of the year on Time magazine, February 25th, 1952. You can go online and look that up. General Wood Sears, Time. There's a great article there. It talks about him and what he said. If you want to know more about how the history of all this plays out, you can get a copy of a book called Unforgiven, written by Charles Walters. It's available either from us as Norm or from the Acres USA bookstore. Now, here's my prescription. Since we abandoned parity policy in 1952, our nation, first gradually and then since 1971, ever more rapidly, has sunk into unserviceable debt, both public and private. In 1983, our nation's agricultural segment sank below the lowest point of parity of the 1930s and is still below it today. Agriculture in this nation is worse off today than it ever was during the 1930s depression. And the only reason that we don't call it a depression that we've had since 1952 is because we have borrowed against what we needed and could have earned as national income by properly pricing our raw material production. We have borrowed against that lost income, and now we say we owe it all to the banks or to somebody else or to the IMF or to, you know, who knows. The problem with debt is there's always an ownership question involved. Somebody owns that debt. Somebody's going to come and say, you owe me. It's mine. You borrowed it from me, mine. All through the day, I, me, mine. So anyway, just weights and measures. One of the things I wanted to get to, just weights and measures policy is what's in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Says Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. That's a just weights and measures policy. That says that, you know, that's what it says in the Bible. We need just weights and measures. Don't mess with your weights and measures. Well, we do mess with our weights and measures. You know, by having the inflation rate of the United States dollar since the Federal Reserve Bank was instituted got operational in 1914. You know, the buying power of the dollar, although the dollar somewhat looks the same, the buying power of the dollar is less than 4 cents now compared to what it was 98 years ago. 2 cents, you know, between 2 cents and 4 cents. You can calculate it however you want to. But that's the purchasing power. That's what's happened to our just weights and measures. If I go in, we're back to the milk and the dollar. If I buy a gallon of milk for $1, I pay $1 for the milk, and I take the milk away. And the milk bought the dollar bought the milk. If I suddenly get to the point where I pay my $1 for the milk and the gallon jug is only 1/3 full, I feel cheated. Rightfully so. Well, our dollar is only 2 cents full. You know, that's what's going on. One last thing that I wanted to leave you with was I did what's called a lost farm income calculation. In other words, if the production of the state of Utah, agricultural production well, all of its production, all of ag production, if it had been paid for at parity, how much income didn't get generated because it was paid for at the price that you actually got? How much income was lost in the state of Utah from 2000 through 2010, so that's an 11-year period. Anybody want to hazard a guess? How much money could Utah have used in the last 11 years? Could you have used $2 billion a year? Would that have made a difference to the state? Because that's what it comes out to. 11 years, $21.33 billion that you could have had that you didn't and can never get it back. Now, how about the United States as a whole? $4.33 trillion in 11 years. You know, that's about the $400 billion that the special committee is supposed to cut. There it is right there. And we could have it just by paying the right price at the first point of sale. It would be earned money circulating through the economy. Well, I'll cut it off there.